All right, we've been covering word recognition. In the last section, we talked a little bit about reading, but let's now talk about how people learn how to read. So this really covers how we teach people to read and to spell, since reading is not an innate part. We know that it has to be taught or it won't be learned, which is good because then it doesn't also have a critical period, which we'll get into in a little bit. And so this is getting into how people learn to read. In the next section, we'll look at a little of verbal comprehension. So there's a pattern to normal reading development. So alphabetic reading is when you're learning how to sound out those words using the grapheme-phoneme correspondence. We're going to talk a lot about the dual root model and the GPC in this section. So if you don't remember it quite well from the last section, be sure you check that out. And skilled reading, where people are good at reading, really involves using that direct route between words and the lexicon. So it involves ignoring the GPC correspondence, now having enough knowledge that you don't need to sound out the words as you're going. So learning to read really involves a shift away from the GPC side and sounding things out to using the lexical route. And that's sort of like an expertise switch from where we're relying on sounding words out, which is going to take longer because it involves that internal speech, to moving to direct access through the lexical route. So some stages to learning to read in the normal reading development. So we've got pre-alphabetic, where we don't know that grapheme-phoneme correspondence. So what we're really learning at this stage, of children mostly, is the connection between symbols and their meanings. So this is where we're mapping those abstract symbols to their meanings. And we remember concepts as visual patterns rather than the sort of phoneme sounded out rules, because we're not quite there yet. So this is like learning enough to be able to do that understanding of those bigram frequencies where we could sound things out. At this point, we're really learning what are words and their meaning, or even what are the letters and their meanings. Partial alphabetic reading phase is when we start to understand those sound to spelling rules. So letters or combinations of letters get associated with their sounds rather than just this particular set of squiggles is the. Now I can start to associate smaller pieces with their sounds. So this is gaining an understanding of the GPC route. And the full alphabetic stage is when I have a full GPC route and I can sound things out. And so I start to realize that that's kind of slow internally. This is sort of not explicit. We realize that that's a slow process, so instead we're going to start forcing things through the lexical route. So this set of squiggles is have. It's a weird word. We're going to go faster if we use look it straight up in the dictionary than sounding it out. So really, stages of normal reading development is about how well the sound to spelling rules are learned, or the grapheme-phoneme correspondence, and then the shift away from using that as our primary source of reading. The last consolidated alphabetic stage is where we're reading at an adult level. Now, many teachers, especially in education, have like reading levels that people read at. And so adult is sort of a tricky concept here, but this is reading at what we would consider normal level for age development. And it's sort of separated from difficulty of the thing that you're reading. This is more about the reader and not what they're reading. And those are sort of separate entities because everyone will struggle with a difficult text. So rhymes are more familiar. So remember that rhymes, onset rhymes, these are the pieces of the word. We can break them down. We can use syllables. We understand morphemes. So this is more of a fluency with language as well as written language. So as we're going through normal reading development, poor readers have a real hard time getting past the second stage. So there were 4 stages here: pre-alphabetic, partial alphabetic, full alphabetic, so our GPC route, and then consolidated, where we stop using the GPC quite so much. And so poor readers get stuck at this partial alphabetic. So those sound to spelling rules that just never really totally consolidate into one giant map of the language. Okay. competent readers understand that alphabetic system of sounds and specific word spellings and their exceptions. And so this is where you have people who understand sort of both routes. And so that really gets into phonological awareness is about what we're about to cover. But poor reading is a difficulty with phonemes, it appears. Dyslexia, also a difficulty with phonemes. Not all types of dyslexia, remember there's surface dyslexia. But generally it's a problem with sounds that comes out as a problem with reading or spelling. And so phonological awareness is sort of a big key to reading development and understanding dyslexia. So it's an awareness of the sounds, and what we can do to measure that awareness is have people just name sounds and words, deleting a sound, so giving people a word and asking for its onset and rhyme. So if I said cave, it would be ka and then ave. It's very important in reading development, and it's really important in just language development overall, so understanding phonemes. And one of the tests for dyslexia is some of these phonological awareness tests. It also gets into our epilinguistic knowledge, which is our implicit knowledge about our own language. So implicit being some of our understanding of grammar, the understanding of morphemes, so our kind of like implicit understanding that some things are not, the sentences don't make sense that way, or they don't go there, that word can't go there. Whereas metalinguistic knowledge is our explicit understanding of the language process. So I could tell you that I could add an ed to make things past tense. At some point, these things, a lot of our implicit rules, our implicit understandings become explicit because of school and training, but children are constantly playing with their implicit understanding of language. That's one reason why they pick GOAD. It's because they understand this idea of past tense, and they have learned this rule by listening to the world around them, and they're testing whether or not that rule works. And that's sort of an implicit thing. At some point, it becomes explicit, but there's plenty of things that we do without realizing that we do them. Okay. So phonological awareness tests tend to measure manipulating a single sound in a word, so picking the onset rhyme and or coming up with rhyming words, holding sounds in memory, segmenting skills, so syllables, and rhyming skills. So we're looking at, can you break the words down into their component sounds, and can you understand what words rhyme? Our implicit awareness is measured by matching sounds, so we ask people to match one sound to another. This is generally given to kids, so it sounds kind of silly when you're an adult, but when you're a kid, not so much. Detecting oddities in sound, and implicit awareness actually has a little effect on learning how to read, believe it or not, but our explicit awareness does. So can people isolate, segment sounds, and manipulate those sounds? If they have trouble doing that and it's explicit, we're going to have trouble learning how to read. And so that's one reason why they teach the phonics method, is because it does appear to have a large component on reading. And if you're not learning these rules implicitly, you have to be taught them explicitly so that you can move on to the consolidated stage of normal reading development. Okay. So in early reading, analogy sometimes it's really hard for especially kids to sound things out because they just don't know the rules yet, or blending of phonemes is kind of difficult. And so it sounds like they've chopped up the word and tried to throw it back together in the blender. And so you can read by analogy, and lots of young children's books encourage this. So we'll give them a word clue like beak, and then ask them to read related words like bean, beal, and peak. So those all have very similar phoneme clusters in them. And so so you're able to see if they're having trouble with the onset or the rhyme part of this, and see kind of where the breakdown is. So which phoneme is the issue. Okay. This analogy learning is only useful if you understand those sound and spelling rules. So it only helps if you know how to sound things out. So breaking things down and learning by analogy can be difficult, because even if you look at this beak example, I had to understand to take off the B and add the P for peak. So that required me to be able to break it down and sound it out. So younger readers tend to prefer that grapheme phoneme correspondence, the sound rules, whereas older readers tend to prefer analogy because their rules are kind of rusty in a sense, because we tend to force everything into the lexical side. And so if I'm doing everything through the lexical side, it's easier for me to do analogy learning. Sometimes this is called the whole word approach, where I am taught words separately instead of their sound rules. Okay. Some languages, like German, are more regular with their sound and spelling rules, so they use analogy a whole lot less. English is a stupid language. There are lots of rules and lots of exceptions to those rules. We even rhymes about our exceptions to those rules. So we tend to be a sort of half and half language because there are so many times that the GPC doesn't work. Another thing that influences, especially in analogy learning, is what's called psycholinguistic grain size, which just sounds like you're talking about psych sand. But it's that different languages have different preferred reading units. So especially if those languages combine words in different ways. So our reading unit size is usually at the children's level, it's individual words, but at an adult level, it tends to be clauses. And so that will make a difference in our ability to use analogies. So when we teach reading, here are some things that matter and don't. So age doesn't seem to matter. Phew. So you can teach adults to read. Older readers do learn faster. They've been speaking and working with the language for longer than younger children, so they're not also learning new words at the same time. They're learning how the words map on the page. Is kind of what we think. So older readers do tend to learn faster because they already have that language experience to map it to. And teaching children at a very young age does not seem to help. So as much as those mommy blogs will tell you that you should teach your children as soon as they can learn to speak, that's actually not true. They will get more experience if you teach at a younger age, but if you control for these factors, it doesn't seem to help in their skilled level of reading. Okay. So there are two main approaches to this, and they map onto the dual root model. So there's the whole word method, or the whole language approach, where we're learning the sound to the way it looks written on the page. And then there's the phonics method, where we're taught how to do sounds with letters and sounding things out. So that's the lexical route and the grapheme phoneme correspondence route. So teaching reading through the sound system is much better, and that's generally what most American children get. So Hooked on Phonics. And Hooked on Phonics works because it forces you to learn the sound and spelling rules, which really strengthens that GPC side so that you can rely on it when you don't have the lexical side. Okay. It does seem to be the best method for teaching. The word-only method really makes you bad at pronouncing new words, and then you end up having what looks like phonological dyslexia because you don't understand the sound segmentation. So there are a couple of ways to teach phonics, though, so we'll get into those. So, analytic phonics, and this is taught after you've sort of started to learn how to read. And so our letter sounds are sort of introduced gradually, and then the reading focuses on words that share sounds. So you have dig, dog, and so getting to really add single letters at a time. And so in that case, we're focusing on vowel development and understanding the rhyme between those two. And so you're sort of slowly adding new letter sounds as you go. Synthetic phonemes is when instead of teaching one at a time, we're taught all the letters and the sounds before anything else. And then you teach word building activities on how to put those words together. And this actually seems to work a little better than the analytic method. So instead of working by analogy, we're working by building blocks is essentially the difference. And it does seem to give children some advantages later in reading development. It helps too if we expose children to print, so games where they manipulate letters and words is highly beneficial. So an interesting thing I bet now is looking at this research, given the number of apps there are for children that make things more tactile and manipulatable in a sense. And I bet this is an interesting field to look at how that affects children's reading abilities. And I bet because of that exposure, that ability to give them more options and more ways to play is probably increasing their abilities in language. I know everyone thinks that phones are killing people's abilities in language, but that is actually not true. And so I bet it does make it easier to teach maybe both methods at once, and kind of go back and forth between them, starting maybe with synthetic and adding analytic, and really merging all of these different tactics together into one app. Just a guess. I bet this is just a really interesting area because of the new developments in technology where we're not playing with little cards on the floor anymore. Now, learning to spell, very different than learning to read. It's actually kind of the reverse of those reading models. You do see the same spelling problems as with reading. So at a very young age, children learn how to spell things. Children spell things they think that words should be based off of instead of their meanings. So the way this works is that whale is a really big animal, and they understand these concepts of big and small. So the word for whale has to be really large because the animal is really large. So they think that there's some relationship between meaning and its abstract symbol, although we've talked all semester about how they aren't. So mosquito should be a really short, small word. So it takes a while for kids to understand that words and their meanings are not tied, and that these rules don't hold. So early spelling errors reflect this overgeneralization. So overgeneralization, remember, is when I take a rule and I apply it to everything. So that's when people say goad. Eat must be ET because it only has two sounds. So where's this extra third letter coming from? I don't need that letter. Let's get rid of it. And then they have some problems with vowels because they're expecting the vowel to make a sound. So happy, that Y is not, Y like boy, so they spell it HAPE because that would be hap-E, let's throw an E on the end. And like often becomes LIK because the E at the end of like does not have a particular sound and it's not licky, so, or likey, so they leave the vowel off. So we do have an issue with vowels, especially because they don't always blend in the way we expect, and then sometimes they're silent. We'll take those large consonant clusters, and reduce them down only into one letter because children, if nothing, know that things should be simpler. So street into street, seat, or a set, B into B, should into C. So a complex consonant cluster like SH and then LD ends up becoming one letter. However, children are sensitive to consonant cluster placement. So CK is a common cluster that occurs in the English language, but it never occurs at the beginning. It always occurs mostly at the end or in the middle of complex words. And so they almost will never spell something that starts with a C with CK. So like chicken wouldn't come up with the CK at the beginning because we're really sensitive to where bigrams are supposed to be because we've been hearing language and we understand the spacing between the words, so we know that the CK never occurs at the beginning. Just like NG never occurs at the beginning of a word, and so we'll always put that one at the end. So, kind of switching track here. In the last section, we talked about acquired disorders, and I don't know if that was super clear because I just finished lecturing it a couple days ago, but acquired disorders are ones that you acquire through some sort of damage or disease or some problem with the body. Developmental disorders are ones that occur because of through the stages of development, and it might be genetic, it might not be. So separating that acquired section that we talked about in the last section for this section. Developmental disorders are ones where we're developing the reading abilities or whatever we're talking about, but it's not due to brain damage. And so reading abilities are then impaired. Acquired disorders are usually through brain damage. They show a lot of the same effects, but not totally. So like deep dyslexia is something that occurs due to brain damage, whereas surface and phonological dyslexia are kind of both. But developmental disorders are one you're going to notice as people are learning, especially in childhood. Okay, so dyslexia is the problem with reading. Dysgraphia is a problem with writing and spelling, but they often co-occur. It's 10 to 30% of the population, so a good chunk of people have one or both of these problems. And so it's really important to study to help people cope. The reading age is often below what you would be expected for of your IQ and age. Now, dyslexia has nothing to do with IQ. However, if you think about IQ tests, they often are word-based, so it's kind of hard to get around them, so they will affect those things, although they are not related to those things. So dyslexia occurs across the entire range of IQs, and so it's not like you only see it at the low end. You also see people with very high IQs that have some form of dyslexia. So kind of dispel that myth that it is a poor IQ problem, it is not. So some biology for dyslexia. So there's some things associated with it, but we're not entirely clear why they do. Left-handedness. And there's some theories on why this happens. And the idea, and I heard this at a lecture talk when I was in grad school, and it's really stuck with me. So I don't know if this theory is still supported, but it's one of those things that just sort of is like, that makes sense. That testosterone apparently tends to help improve neural growth on the right side of the body. So the right brain during development. So while mom is pregnant with baby, the more testosterone there is, the more sort of neural connectedness you get on the right side. Well, that's a right advantage, but the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So there tends to be a preference for left-handedness. Because those motor neurons are a little bit better. But the left side of the brain is the one that tends to do language. So that puts the language hemisphere at a slight disadvantage. You also tend to see these sorts of children who are dyslexic left-handed also be math gifted, because math tends to be a spatial awareness thing on the right side of the brain. And so they tend to correlate, but there's no good way to tell if one of those things is causing all of that or if it's related to something else, because you can't really ask pregnant mothers if you could shoot them up with testosterone, because that's not ethical. So these are just some like things that correlate, but we're not entirely sure why. There has been some research that suggests that dyslexics, well, it's a weird word, are clumsier. I don't know how much that holds water. It's sort of one of those things that some people say yes, some people say no. And then sometimes there is visual short-term memory impairment, which we think might actually be part of the cause, because it's hard to segment symbols if you're having a hard time keeping them in memory. Okay. Some areas of the brain that we think are related. So the magnocellular visual pathway. These are the large cells that respond to contrast between letters. And this is really an interesting piece, and it's not everyone in dyslexia, and I think it has a specific name, but I can't quite remember what it is at the moment, where people think the letters are dancing around. And so there's something about these cells that just don't quite work right, and the letters seem to be wiggling. And that makes it's very distracting, it's very hard to read if everything is dancing around. And there is some research that supports that if you put the words on a different color, so if you put it on blue paper or I've heard yellow paper, that seems to help. And that might be because you are not distracted, but a different part of the brain is responding to the color of the paper, and that might help cancel it out. I've heard that, read that somewhere, but I don't know how much that research has been well supported or is still being researched. I cannot say this word. Planum temporale, I have no idea. I'm trying to segment it. So an example about segmentation issues, don't know if that's right. Some biology person needs to correct me. But it's a structure in Wernicke's. Remember Wernicke's back here by your left ear. That's usually larger in the left side of the brain. for normal people, and it's about the same size on both sides for dyslexics. So that tends to cause some problems with phonology, which is what we think the general issue with dyslexia is. So more neurons in occipital areas are people are sort of using visual information to cope with a problem. So if I have less neurons in an area that's supposed to be for sound, I tend to bias it towards the neurons in the visual cortex to help me sort of deal with that. And that tends to make me move away from using sounds and towards using that lexical route, which is good until I hit a new word and then I don't know how to pronounce it. So surface dyslexia is the non-sound issue. So we make the same errors people do when reading at sounding out non-words, because I don't have anything in my lexical pathway to point me what to do. And so people who have this sort of problem are usually reading less, they have visual perceptual deficits, so they have trouble just looking at the words, the letters on the page, and they can't connect that orthography to the phonology. So I can't even segment the words out to make those sounds. Okay. Phonological dyslexia is a damage to the phonological representation. So I just don't understand the sounds themselves. Okay. So what can we do? What can we do to work on solving the problem? I don't know that there's a solution to developmental dyslexia or acquired dyslexia. There's just training and sort of overcoming, if you will. It's not like there's a cure. What we can do, especially at a young age, is teach people phonological awareness. So these are games hooked on phonics, just getting people to work more with sounds. There is some support for the idea of speech. I can only think speech path because I'm thinking of communication sciences. Speech training, essentially teaching people how to make the sounds with their mouth, seems to help, and when you correspondingly tag that with the visual cues for the words. So maybe the problem isn't even a misunderstanding of sounds, I just can't even figure out how to make them. Teaching people how to segment words into onset and rhyme. So a lot of this comes in the form of games to make it more fun than just like, look, apple, pa. So you make this into the thing like Hooked on Phonics has, where it's a game where you level up to make it more fun for people to play, and then reading becomes fun instead of something scary. Okay. Also some other multi-sensory methods. I'm not even going to butcher these people's names. Orden was one of the original people who argued that dyslexia was a visual problem, which hasn't been supported. But getting people to attack the problem in what's called dual coding, or in this case multi-coding, where if we have things that are both visual and verbal and sort of abstract, we're going to remember them better. So if we can attack the problem by adding more sensations to it, the more memories that are attached, the better we're going to do. So it's a systematic and explicit teaching of grapheme phoneme rules. And so they get children to see the visual cues, say aloud, so auditory cues, write, which is more of a motor cortex cue, and to feel the words. So they have them have like the way letters feel, or like blocks and stuff. And because we're attacking this from 4 different directions and 4 different sort of body systems, it does work well, because we just have more neurons that are sort of processing that information, and any one way we can get it in that'll help me read better. So it sort of goes back to more of a basic cognitive processing, where the more ways we have something remembered, the better it is we are at it. And so that's one reason we think it works. Alright, so that's it for learning how to read and a little bit more on dyslexia, this time focusing on developmental dyslexia.